Throughout the centuries and history, there have been many different monarchs who have had their coffins and burial vaults broken into, and these were opened for different reasons. Some inquisitive people wanted to see if a king or queen was buried inside their tombs, and also what their remains were like. One of Henry VIII's wives even had her tomb desecrated, and centuries after her death, people defiled her remains, dancing with her corpse before tossing it aside and even burying it the wrong way round. But in some cases there were a number of European monarchs who had their bodies desecrated and their burial vaults disturbed. In this documentary, we look at some of the most causes of this and look at the European monarchs whose coffins were opened. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 16th of October 1793, at the Place de la Révolution in Paris, the former Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, made her slow way to the guillotine. In the months before, her husband, King Louis XVI, had been executed on the same device at the same place, and many did not know what to do with the Queen following her husband's execution. Some were in favour of exiling her, and others would have preferred to see her left to rot in prison, as she was a staunch and strong symbol of hatred across the nation. She was hated massively and had little remorse for the French people who were starving. But following the Queen's execution, what happened to her head and also her body? Marie Antoinette was tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal on the 14th of October 1793. It is believed that she was already condemned to death when she was brought to trial, and her lawyers were given not long to sort out her defence. She was accused with a huge amount of charges, including sending millions of lives to Austria, planning a massacre, incest, and declaring her son to be the new French king. But Marie Antoinette was on the 16th of October declared guilty of the three main charges: depleting the national treasury, conspiracy against the security of the state, and high treason. Her lawyers were shocked, as they thought she would just have a prison sentence, but the court sentenced her to death. In preparation for her execution, Marie was forced to change clothes in front of her guards, and she was ordered to wear a plain white dress. Her hair had been cut by guards in preparation for the guillotine, and it was cut short, and her hands were tied behind her back, and she was put on a rope lead before she was then taken from her prison to the execution scaffold on an open cart. It was an undignified end for the former Queen of France, and the people of Paris jeered at her as she passed in the cart, and it took an hour for the convoy to get to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine sat. Whilst this was happening, she was noted to have been rather calm, as the court screamed obscenities and hatred at her, and her priest sat next to Marie in the cart, but she ignored him throughout her final journey. She arrived at the guillotine on the 16th of October 1793 at 12:15 p.m, and she was led up the steps of the scaffold. The former queen stood on the foot of the executioner, and her final words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." The executioner then fastened her to the wooden board and then quickly slid Marie under the guillotine before he released the blade, and her head was taken clean off in one go by the device. But what happened to her body after this? You see, her head would have been grabbed from the basket where it fell, and it was then displayed to the crowd. One painting of this event shows the Queen's head on a pike, but it shows for certain that following her execution that the Queen's body and also her head was taken to the Madeleine Cemetery nearby, and that it was thrown in an unmarked grave. At the time, Madame Tussaud would, whilst the gravediggers were on a lunch break, sneak into the cemetery and would take a cast of Marie Antoinette's head following her beheading. But this would not be the end of the story of the Queen's body and head, as in 1814, at the orders of King Louis XVIII, an inquiry was launched to locate the body of Marie Antoinette. Her husband, King Louis XVI's body was located, and the exhumations took place in the presence of many ministers and court officials on the 18th of January 1815. The Queen's remains were found on this day, and the king's would be found on the following day. Marie's grave was found rather easily, and a layer of quicklime had solidified over the coffin, and this allowed her remains to be preserved. Many of her bones were found, including her skull, which was said to have been intact. Workers also found a woman's stocking, similar to one that the Queen was given in her imprisonment, and many people were moved by the location of Marie Antoinette's remains. Some prayed by the gravesite, and one official even fainted. The workers placed the bones and personal items inside a couple of chests, and they were then moved to a chapel where they were surrounded by lit candles. It's never been established completely that these were the correct bodies that were found, and some historians are sceptical as they believed that the cemetery was very full. But the preservation of Marie's remains would have happened if the quicklime did solidify. The location of Marie's body is believed could have been marked with a cross on the wall near to it, and it was clear that the coffin she had been placed in was still intact. The hair also belonged to a woman that was found along with the clothes as mentioned, which were similar to what Marie was executed in. Following this, they were then prepared to be buried in the royal vault in the Basilica of St. Denis. The interring of these royal remains took place on the 21st of January, and one eyewitness described the procession and the proceedings. He said, "A detachment of artillery joined the procession at the barrier St. Denis and followed it, firing minute guns. A regiment of the king's chasseurs lined the road from Paris to St. Denis. The drums and musical instruments were covered with black serge, and the arms and the colours of the troops were ornamented with crape. A deep and solemn silence prevailed among the multitudes who thronged the streets and road by which the procession passed." Upon reaching the church of St. Denis, the bodies were taken from the cart by the Gardes de la Manche and carried into the church, where they were received by the clergy and presented by the Bishop of Carcassonne to the Bishop of Aire. They were then placed upon a lofty tomb of state in the midst of the choir. Monsieur, after retiring for a few minutes, entered the church and was followed by the Duke of Angoulême, the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orleans, and the Prince de Conde, who occupied the stalls on the right nearest to the altar. The Duchess of Orleans, the Duchess of Bourbon, and Mademoiselle of Orleans entered the opposite stalls. Next to the Prince sat the Duke of Dalmatia, the Duke of Reggio, Count Bartholomew, and M. Lane, whom the king had appointed to support the pall when the coffins were carried to the vault. The other stalls were occupied by deputations from the court of Castillon, the court of Amcops, and the council of the university, the Cour Royale, the municipality, the Tribunal de Premier Instance. The choir was filled by the great officers of the king's household, the officers of the prince's household, his majesty's ministers, the high personages appointed to form part of the procession, the marshals and peers of France, the deputies of the departments, the grand crosses of the offer of the Major General and staff of the National Guards, the governor of the 1st Military Division and his staff, and a great number of generals and other military officers, the governess of the royal children, the ladies-in-waiting upon her late majesty, and the ladies-in-waiting upon the Duchess of Angoulême, sat upon benches near the coffins. 400 young ladies of the Maison Royale St. Denis were seated in front of the altar. When all these attendants had taken their places, the service commenced. The princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies, and their assistants, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral operation was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and 2 princes and his sons descended, and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris during the service of St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. To perpetuate the memory of these august victims, the king had ordained that solemn funeral services shall be performed annually in all the churches of the kingdom on the 21st of January for the repose of the soul of Louis XVI, and on the 16th of October for all that of his royal consort, and that on those days the court shall wear mourning, and the public offices, courts of justice, exchange, and theatres be closed. It was a huge moment in history, as the remains of the executed French king and queen, a couple of decades after their execution, were exhumed, and they were then given a burial befitting their status. Still, at this time, Marie Antoinette was considered a controversial figure. Princess Maria of Romania was born on the 6th of January 1900 inside of Friedestein Palace in what was the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha within the German Empire. She was actually named after her grandmother, who was the Grand Duchess of Russia, and her parents were the future King Ferdinand I of Romania and Princess Marie of Edinburgh. Her mother claimed about Maria that she was from her first day a child of joy and sunshine, for these miracles do come to pass, gay, smiling, and astonishingly loving from her tenderest infancy. She was more than a consolation, she was a revelation, and I loved her with a love difficult to describe. I could not let her out of my sight. She was a message of peace and hope. We christened her Marie after my mother and her mother before her, but we called her Mignon, and this name has stuck to her forever. To us all she is and always will be Mignon. Her mother and father did become the King and Queen of Romania, and Maria travelled with them to Romania and she lived there. But at the time she was the young woman, and the First World War greeted Europe, and Princess Maria actually served as a nurse alongside her mother. She was considered a beautiful young woman, and she enjoyed life as a royal, taking luxurious holidays with her family. But in 1922, King Alexander of Yugoslavia was introduced to Maria, and Maria and Alexander then fell in love and got engaged. The pair were married on the 8th of June 1922, and it was a large event that took place in Belgrade at St. Michael's Cathedral. Different representatives from different nations, including many royals, attended, but on the 3rd of October 1929, Maria became the Queen of Yugoslavia, as Alexander renamed the country and nation. The couple settled on a large estate as the royal residence in Belgrade, as it wasn't completed, and Maria was seen as a fair woman who established good links with different religious figures, and she was also rather generous. Maria helped out the local peasants who worked on her estate, and she also founded many different schools for local children, and even paid for many scholarships so that poorer children could attend better schools, and therefore have a better chance at a start in life. She had a number of children too, and she did live a simple life, and her husband's popularity also increased because of his wife that was by his side. Maria herself was also a good foreign ambassador. She could speak many different languages, and she would entertain other monarchs and members of royal families, and she was good company. She was self-sufficient and also did not rely on drivers or others to ferry her around different places. However, her husband was assassinated in 1934 in Marseille. Her oldest son, who was just 11 at the time, then became Peter II of Yugoslavia, and he would become the last king to reign over the country. A regency council was established, and Maria was given a very healthy allowance to raise her sons and to support herself, and she got involved in campaigns to help the sick. She did suffer with her health following her husband's death, and in 1938 she purchased a farm in Bedfordshire in England. As the Second World War broke out, she then moved here permanently, and she took her younger children with her and left her eldest son in the nation as he was the monarch. She was later given the title of Queen Mother, but during the Second World War, Yugoslavia would declare itself neutral. However, in the March of 1941, Yugoslavia was declared an ally of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, as the regent Prince Paul said this. Maria's son, King Peter II, did depose Prince Paul as regent, but the Nazis would then attack Yugoslavia, forcing King Peter II to flee to Britain, and he would then link up with his mother again. Maria thought that she should probably head back to Yugoslavia to stand for Yugoslav people, many of whom had joined the partisans and began to resist the German forces. But during World War II, Maria did send help via the Red Cross to those Yugoslav people who had become prisoners of war. She sent these under a false name, but the prisoners knew who was behind the parcels. However, following the conflict on the 29th of November 1945, the monarch inside of Yugoslavia was abolished, and her son, the king, then went to America and settled. Maria remained in England and purchased a farm in Kent, and she even enjoyed working on the fields herself. She didn't have too much contact with the British royal family, and she also got involved in the Yugoslav community in London, and she also exhibited much of her own artwork. But she remained in exile for the rest of her life, and she then died on the 22nd of June 1961 at the age of 61. She had a funeral which was held not inside of a royal chapel but inside of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Notting Hill. And following her funeral, her remains and coffin were carried to the royal burial ground at Frogmore, which is attached to Windsor Castle. Maria's coffin was lowered into a burial spot which had been dug for her, and she was laid to rest for many years. But then in the April of 2013, there was an appeal lodged to the British royal family to allow Queen Maria's remains to be exhumed from the royal burial ground at Frogmore and then be repatriated back home to the land where she ruled. Queen Elizabeth II gave consent for the exhumation to take place, as had Crown Prince Alexander and other surviving relatives of Maria. The Dean of Windsor also expressed his support for the disinterment. The Burial Act of 1857 claims that, except where a body is removed from one consecrated place of burial to another by faculty, it is not lawful to move remains that have been interred in a place of burial without licence under the hand of one of Her Majesty's principal Secretaries of State, and with such precautious as such the Secretary of State may prescribe the conditions of such licence. Maria had the permission of the Queen for her remains to be dug up, and a licence to exhume her was granted. It was said that she would be transported to the Republic of Serbia to be reinterred in the Oplenk Royal Mausoleum. The exhumation took place and the ground was broken inside of the royal burial ground, and her remains were dug out of the grave and were lifted out. Her coffin was lifted, and there must have been some form of protective cover or something over this, or her remains may have been placed inside of a different coffin. The exact specifics of the exhumation are rather secretive, but the remains of Queen Maria were then taken back to her former lands, and she would be reinterred inside of the royal mausoleum. It's rare for someone to be exhumed from a site of royal burials, such as Westminster Abbey or St George's Chapel, and it's even rarer for the remains of a royal to be dug up and repatriated to a different country. But Maria was allowed a burial inside of the prestigious burial site in the first place because of her stature as a monarch. But Elizabeth II permitted the consecrated ground to be broken within the burial ground and the removal of the Queen of Yugoslavia's body. Maria, by all accounts, was a very kind and nice woman who served the people well, and she today is buried in the land which she ruled over. One of the most captivating women of the 16th century was Mary, Queen of Scots. She had a very tumultuous love life, and she was married to the King of France that died young, and she also married a man who was blown up. Her third husband was the man suspected of killing her second, but inside the walls of a modest castle in England, Mary, Queen of Scots, would be executed in brutal fashion. A headsman took her head off in a number of swings of his axe, following her death sentence for treason. Mary had been involved in a number of plots against the life of Queen Elizabeth I, and following the Babington plot, the Queen of England had had enough and finally signed her death warrant. But following her execution, Mary's body was not treated well, and was originally buried nearby at Peterborough Cathedral. However, this was then dug up and moved to Westminster Abbey. But on a number of occasions, Mary's executed resting body was disinterred and was even broken into when it was placed in its final resting place. Mary Queen of Scots was not executed in one single strike of the axe. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head, and the second blow severed the neck except a small bit of sinew, which was then cut through using the executioner's axe. Her head was held aloft inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, and the executioner declared, "God save the Queen." Following this, her wig came loose, and her head then fell onto the floor. But after her execution, everything which was touched by her blood, including her clothing and even the executioner's block, was thrown into the fireplace of the great hall, to stop relic hunters obtaining relics from the dead Queen of Scotland. Mary's execution greatly distressed Queen Elizabeth I, and she even had one of her counsellors thrown inside the Tower of London. But Mary Queen of Scots, before her death, had given strict instruction that after her death she wanted to be buried in France alongside her first husband. This was refused by Elizabeth I, and her body was then embalmed and was left inside a secure lead coffin inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. Mary's body was left unburied and in a coffin which was sealed for a number of months, as a suitable location to bury her was not found. Eventually the authorities settled on Peterborough Cathedral, which was the closest cathedral to the execution site. Her entrails and heart were buried within Fotheringhay Castle's grounds, and then after 6 months Elizabeth I ordered her burial. Mary's request was denied, and the brutal register for Peterborough Cathedral for 1587 said, "The Queen of Scots was most sumptuously buried in ye Cathedral Church of Peterborough, the 1st day of August 1587, who was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle, the 8th of February before." Queen Elizabeth's household officers and heralds arrived in Peterborough in later July to choose the burial place, and they selected a site directly opposite Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. A rich hearse was erected near the first steps of the choir, and the whole of the cathedral was decorated with black hangings. On the 30th of July between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m, the body was brought from Fotheringhay by torchlight in a chariot hung with black velvet, adorned with Mary Queen of Scots symbols. It was attended on by the Bishop and Dean of Peterborough, and many other officials, along with members of Mary's household. The body was taken into the cathedral, and then it was laid into the vault. On the Monday afternoon, a group of lords and ladies arrived at the bishop's palace, which was hung in black, and then the following morning, members of the clergy and lords and ladies gathered in the cathedral for a sermon by the Bishop of Lincoln, who said that he hoped Mary was saved, despite having died a Catholic. Her officials and servants then broke their staves of office and placed them in Mary's grave, and then mourners had another huge feast, and everyone went home. A helmet, sword and shield were then installed to hang above the tomb, but this was not what Mary wanted. But her tomb and grave would then be broken into. In 1603, following the death of Elizabeth I, Mary's son James succeeded onto the throne and became known as King James I. He was already the Scottish king, and he unionised the crowns. But 3 years after coming onto the throne, he began to plan for the reburial of his mother inside of Westminster Abbey. Plans took years to be drawn up, and Mary Queen of Scots would be reburied in 1612, with an extravagant tomb taking 6 years to complete. Her remains were then dug up from Peterborough Cathedral, and they were taken on the journey to Westminster Abbey in London. A royal warrant granted the burial, and this took place on the 11th of October. The King James I had erected a magnificent marble tomb for her on the south aisle of the Lady Chapel, under a fine white marble effigy, under a canopy. Her effigy showed her wearing a close-fitting coif, a laced ruff and long mantle. A crowned Scottish lion stands by her feet. She was buried in a chapel opposite Elizabeth I, but her tomb was slightly grander than Elizabeth's, a small dig that James I had against the Queen who ordered his mother's execution. But Mary, Queen of Scots' remains would be broken into yet again, and in 1867 Arthur P. Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, would oversee and order a search of her vault. The Dean of Westminster at the time was searching for the lost tomb of King James I, which was later found in the vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but at the time they believed that the remains could have been found within the same vault of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. After the exhumation and lifting of the tomb, Stanley found that Mary's lead coffin was along the north wall of the vault, but she was not alone. Shockingly, the vault contained a number of other burials too, meaning that over the years, Mary, Queen of Scots' vault had been opened a number of times, with other members of the royal family being interred near to her. Mary was found beneath that of Lady Arabella, Stuart's coffin, and inside the vault was also Henry, the Prince of Wales, Anne Hyde, the Duchess of York, and the mother of two Stuart queens, Mary II and Anne, Elizabeth, the Winter Queen of Bohemia, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and also many children of James II were also held here. Interestingly, many of those inside this vault were descendants of the Stuarts, the very dynasty that Mary was the head of. Queen Anne and her surviving child, the Duke of Gloucester, were also found there. But throughout the centuries, Mary, Queen of Scots, following her death, was disturbed a number of times. Following her brutal execution, she was disemboweled, and her remains were then buried inside the grounds of Fotheringhay Castle. Then her body was taken to the nearby Cathedral of Peterborough, before it was buried in a huge ceremony there, with a lot of respect. But around 25 years later, she was disinterred and dug up again at the request of her son, the then King of England and Scotland. She was then taken to Westminster Abbey, and the heart of religion in England, and was buried in a huge and ornate tomb befitting her status. Then, 200 years after this, her vault was disturbed as the officials inside of Westminster Abbey were searching for the remains of her son. Despite living a very captivating life, her final moments were chaotic, botched, and still today she is laid to rest in a place nowhere near where she wanted to be. Barbara Radziwill was born in December of 1520, and her father was the voivode of Trakai, and her mother was a very noble person also. It's believed that she had a rather settled early life. However, she wasn't necessarily educated in a way that a queen would be. She was not schooled like a princess would be, and she did not learn many languages that were hoped to be useful if she married a European noble or even a prince. She could only speak and write in her native Polish, and she was considered a very beautiful young woman, who was also very charming. She was greatly interested in cosmetics and also fashion, and she often wore heavy lead makeup like many 16th century women would, for example, Elizabeth I. Much of this makeup was, of course, very dangerous, as it was actually lead-based. She was a prominent member of the nobility. She was offered up to marry Stanislavus Katauskas, who was a member of the Lithuanian nobility. With this, they even had a wedding treaty drawn up. However, the pair married on the 18th of May 1537, and Barbara at the time was around 16 years old. In her dowry there was a significant amount of wealth, and also items such as silver crockery and horses. Their marriage was short-lived though, as after 5 years Barbara's husband died, after a short battle with an illness. However, the marriage did not produce any children. But Barbara was now a catch, and within 6 months of her husband's death she was having an affair with Sigismund Augustus, who was the future king of Poland, and was the Grand Duke of Lithuania. The pair's affair began in 1543, but Sigismund was married to Elizabeth of Austria. The pair would travel to Vilnius, where Barbara lived with her mother. However, the next year Sigismund's wife died from complications following a seizure. After this, the Prince of Poland and Barbara Radziwill would spend a lot of time together, and it's believed that they were both in love. There were many rumours from the royal court about the pair, and they would go together hunting. Gossip continued, and it's believed that Sigismund even had a tunnel made to Barbara's apartments from the royal palace, so in the evening the pair could meet together in secret and continue their affair. At the time, many people wanted the prince to marry another woman, be it a European princess, to secure alliances for Poland and to unite European dynasties. However, Barbara and Sigismund were in love, and in 1547 they married in secret. Now, their wedding took place at the end of July 1547, and at the start of August 1547, and the wedding was kept quiet, as it's believed that Barbara may have been pregnant at the time. But this child did not live, and Sigismund then told his parents about their marriage. This did not go down well at all, and the royal family were enraged. Many people considered Barbara to have been a harlot and nothing more than a woman that Sigismund slept with, and they did not take into account that Barbara and Sigismund were in love. Some accused her of being a witch, and they accused her of using sorcery and potions to seduce the prince and to trap him. But when his father died, there were many people who said that Sigismund, the next king, should leave his wife. However, the new Sigismund II remained with Barbara, and the royal couple moved into the royal palaces, and they lived a very lavish lifestyle, and Barbara got a huge amount of land and jewellery, along with royal palaces. However, she was a queen now, who was not interested in politics. But the Radziwill family then sought to secure power and further wealth for their family. They wanted Barbara to be coronated and to be formally recognised as the Queen of Poland, not just the wife of the king. The king also wanted this, and Sigismund made sure that Barbara should be the Queen of Poland. This went ahead, and she was crowned Queen of Poland on the 7th of December 1550, which did attract criticism. However, her reign as queen was short-lived. When she married the Polish king, she was suffering with her health, and she was often very sick, and she had problems with her stomach and also gallstones. But after the coronation, things got even worse for her. She had a fever and also lost her appetite. The stomach pain got much worse, and her stomach had a lump in it which was filled with pus and likely contributed to blood poisoning. But the king was seeing his new wife dying and getting sicker each day, and Sigismund asked the best doctors in the land to treat her. But despite a short recovery, she went downhill yet again. As things continued, her health continued to deteriorate, and the king himself was waiting on his dying wife. Barbara now began to stink of pus, and she was suffering with diarrhoea and sickness. But on the 8th of May 1551, in Krakow, Barbara Radziwill, the Queen of Poland, died in her bed. She insisted that she should be buried back in Vilnius, and that her body should be taken to the cathedral, and she was actually buried next to Sigismund's first wife that had died. However, the king was gutted and distraught, and he walked a large part of the journey to the cathedral following her coffin on foot. But after her death, he wore mourning black and became much more serious, shunning the partying life and lavish life. Now, it is not known for certain what killed Barbara, but some historians have said that it was ovarian cancer or cervical cancer. But at the time, many dissenters claimed that she had suffered from syphilis. But this was not the end of her story, as her remains would be uncovered and found almost 400 years after her death. In 1931, the remains of Barbara, the Queen of Poland, emerged and were found. Following her death on the journey from Krakow to Vilnius, her remains had been covered in some strange substance to help preserve them during the long summer days travelling. Her body was coated in a mix of ash and burned lime to protect her remains, and the wooden coffin she had been placed inside of had rotted in the 400 years since her death. But the lime that covered her body had formed a protective shell, and with this her remains were preserved well by the standards of 4 centuries' worth of decay. Now, the people who discovered her remains were horrified and shocked, and Barbara's remains were covered in her jewellery, and on top of her head was a silver gilded crown, and in her arms was a silver sceptre, along with the golden orb and a cross which was given to her from the king, her husband. These artefacts were amazingly preserved, but during the deadliest conflict in human history, they could not escape the clutches of the Nazis. Now, as the Second World War broke out, Vilnius was captured and seized by the Nazis, and they treated the civilians there terribly. They set up 2 ghettos for the huge Jewish population there, and the Nazis looted and savaged Jewish homes, stealing art and wealth. But some of Barbara's jewellery and artefacts that she had been buried with and had been in her tomb were stolen and went missing. It's believed that these were taken by the Nazis who broke into her tomb to take these riches. But when her remains were found and discovered, it was checked and repaired by the professors in a nearby university. They shockingly glued some of her remains together, and they fixed some of her skeleton. Following this, they worked out that she was 5'3" tall and had white and straight teeth, as well as a slim body and a narrow face. But it was said that she had some strange defects, including an extra rib. She also had signs of rickets, and her remains were then hidden away again because of the Second World War. They were moved to a crypt under the Chapel of St. Casimir, and they were left there until 2001. But then more work took place on her remains, and experts reconstructed her face to see what she would have looked like. Barbara Radziwill was a queen who was very controversial in the 16th century, and in Poland a number of people did not want her on the throne as queen. But she was a woman who captured the heart of the Polish king, but she suffered greatly in her final days. She died a very painful death, and then her remains were looted and were taken by the Nazis, and much of the wealth inside of her coffin that she was buried with then disappeared during the German occupation of Vilnius. What was shocking was that her remains were broken into, and her coffin was looted in the last century, despite the fact she had died in the 16th century. The afterlife of Barbara Radziwill was a shocking one. One of the most shocking moments in French history was when the king, Louis XVI, was led towards the guillotine, and the monarch was to lose his head. It was a shocking consequence of the French Revolution, and across the nation the monarchy were very unpopular, as they were spending huge sums of money whilst people were starving. It was a terrible situation, but Charles Henry Sanson would be the man who operated the guillotine, taking the head clean off the French king. But following this, his remains were later dug up decades after his execution, and they were then reburied. But what is the story of the exhumation of the French king? King Louis XVI was publicly executed on the 21st of January 1793 at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. His trial had concluded 4 days before, and it was stated that he was to be convicted of high treason, and he was condemned to death by a simple majority. Charles Henry Sanson, who was the high executioner of the First French Republic, had to be convinced to be the man who would take the king's head. But on the morning of his execution he woke up early, and he was helped to be dressed by his valet before he met with an Irish priest named Henry Essex Edgeworth. The king made his final confession and heard his last mass, and was given communion. But then Louis was advised by the priest to avoid a final farewell to his children, as it would be too heartbreaking, and then a carriage had arrived to pick him up. Final arrangements were sorted out as to what to do with the king's last belongings, and he then sat in the carriage that left the temple at 9 o'clock with his priest and a number of guards. The carriage for more than an hour travelled with drummers playing along the journey to drown out any support for the king, and a cavalry force also made its way with the carriage, and they had their sabres drawn. 80,000 men at arms stationed to keep the crowd in control. There were talks of a last-minute rescue mission for the king, as in the neighbourhood of Rue de Clergy, a baron and supporter of the royal family had summoned 300 royalists to try and help the king escape. He was to be hidden in a house, but eventually the rebellion and attempt failed, and 3 men were killed in this. But at 10, the carriage containing Louis XVI arrived at the Place de la Révolution, and it came to a stop close to an area where the scaffold had been made, and on this guillotine was placed. This area was also surrounded by guns and drums, and many in the crowd were armed and they had pikes and weapons, but the king was then helped from the carriage. And he was then led up the scaffold, and following this the executioner, Charles Henry Sansom, approached the king and asked his assistants to bind the king's hands together. The king at the first instance refused to allow this, and then he gave over as his handkerchief was used instead of a rope, and the executioners then cut the king's hair roughly and also removed the collar of his shirt. They did this to try and ensure that the guillotine blade would slice through his neck in a quick and rapid manner without any issues. After this, Louis tried to speak to the crowd, but he was drowned out by the drum roll that was ordered, and then the king was strapped to a wooden board. He was then slid under the guillotine blade, and Sanson then released the blade, and this then took the king's head off. One witness claimed that the blade did not cut the neck, but instead went through the back of his skull and into his jaw. It was an instant and brutal death. And then the executioner picked the king's head up from the basket and showed it to the crowd. There were some reports that he then dropped this into the crowd, and that the guards then rushed to it and dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood. The executioner's account would state, "Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked Sanson why the drums had stopped beating. He came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioner to get on with their work. He was strapped down. He exclaimed, 'My people, I die innocent.' Then, turning towards his executioner, Louis XVI declared, 'Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French.' The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sanson showed the head of Louis XVI to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la nation! Vive la République!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. But this was not the end of the king's story, as his body and remains were then taken to the Madeleine cemetery, where they were then buried quickly and hastily. One witness said of this, "Shortly afterwards the body of Louis was brought to the cemetery by a detachment of gendarmes on foot, who confirmed that the body was entire with all of its limbs, the head being separate from the trunk. We noted that their hair had been cut behind the head, and that the corpse was without neckerchief, coat or shoes. It was wearing a shirt, a quilted waistcoat, grey breeches, and a pair of grey silk stockings. Thus dressed, the body was placed in a coffin which was lowered into the ditch. This was immediately filled in. All was carried out in accordance with the orders of the Executive Council of the French Republic. However, the body of the king would be exhumed. In 1814, the debate emerged about how possible this was, and the exhumation began on the 18th of January 1815. The former gravedigger took part, and the Queen's remains would be found on the first day, and King Louis XVI would be found the day after. Marie Antoinette, Louis's Queen's body, was found rather easily, but the search for the king was not as easy. A deep trench was dug near the wall, and then the workers found several pieces of board from a coffin before they came across the skeleton of a man who had lost his head and who had wounds to his skull. His head had been placed between his legs when buried, but despite no clothing being found, the witnesses claimed that they had found the remains of the king. They were completely convinced that this was King Louis XVI. Further officials confirmed this, and then their remains were transferred into a lead coffin. There has been some doubt as to whether this was the correct location, but the location was confirmed to have been roughly in the correct spot as to where the king was buried. The body was to be buried 12 feet down and covered in quicklime, and the remains of the king had been damaged by this, and the body was found at the correct depth. A further search did take place in the area at the same depth to make sure they had the king's remains, and there were not any other remains nearby. But the plan was to now bury the remains of the king along with his queen Marie Antoinette in a more dignified manner and in a place befitting their royal status. The Madeleine Cemetery had become too full, and because of this it had been closed. The bodies were then taken to the Basilica of St. Denis, and one eyewitness then recounts the service that took place for the king. It was said, "Upon reaching the church of St. Denis, the bodies were taken from the car by the guards de la Marche and carried into the church, where they were received by the clergy and presented by the Bishop of Carcassonne, the Bishop of Aire. They were then placed upon a lofty tomb of state in the midst of the choir. Monsieur, after retiring for a few minutes, entered the church and was followed by the Duke of Angoulême, the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orléans, and the Prince of de Conde, who occupied the stalls on the right nearest the altar. The Duchess of Orléans, the Duchess of Bourbon, and Mademoiselle of Orléans entered the opposite stalls. Next to the princes sat the Duke of Dalmatia, the Duke of Reggio, and the court Bartholomew and M. Lane, whom the king had appointed to support the pole when the coffin was carried to the vault. The other stalls were occupied by deputations from the Court of Cassation, the Court of Ecom, the Council of the University, the Cour Royal, the Municipality, and the Tribunal de Premier Instance. The choir was filled by the great officers of the king's household, the officers of the princes' households, His Majesty's ministers, the high personages appointed to form part of the procession, the marshals and peers of France, the deputies of the departments, the grand crosses of the order of the Major General and staff of the National Guards, the governor of the 1st Military Division and his staff, and a great number of generals and other military officers. The governess of the royal children, the ladies-in-waiting upon her late Majesty, and the ladies-in-waiting upon the Duchess of Angoulême sat upon the benches near the coffins. 400 young ladies of the Maison Royale de St. Denis were seated in the front of the altar. When all these attendants had taken their place, the service commenced. The princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of Ceremonies, and their assistants, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and 2 princes, his sons, descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service of St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. The execution of the King of France was a brutal and barbaric moment in France, but the discovery and reburial of his body decades later was also a shocking moment. He was a man who was considered the scourge of France, with his apathy for the suffering of his people, but today he lays to rest in a tomb that is more befitting of his title as a royal, rather than laying in a grave with no marker.